As wide-scale looting continues across townships in Durban and attacks on foreign nationals continue, the question of who has drawn colonial borders that separate Africans rears its ugly head once again. Some critics say these borders, like colonial statues that have now polarized South Africans, have separated and alienated Africans from their ancestral family unit. Should they also be brought down? For a more detailed analysis, Kate Stegeman from Good Governance Africa joins us. Good evening, Kate, and thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Lily.
Now, will bringing down borders help to unite Africans?
The fact of the matter is that the political situation that we have right now in the world is that we have less of an emphasis on borders and more of an emphasis on regionality. So no, we should absolutely not be bringing down borders per se. We have porous borders, and when it comes to criminal activity, those borders need to be guarded. But when it comes to refugees, we need to allow them into the country. We've signed various statutes of international law to protect those refugees. Similarly with economic migrants, it benefits our economy to have people here sharing their skills. So we need more border crossing in the right way.
Now, South African Human Rights Commission says recent attacks on foreign nationals is not really xenophobic, but rather Afrophobia. What's your take on this?
Well, I think that comes down to semantics at the end of the day. I think xenophobia is exactly what it is. We've also had, and whether we say xenophobia or Afrophobia, I think, as I said, that's semantics. But really what we've seen recently is that some leaders, whether it's various ministers or various premiers in and around the country, have tried to call the early attacks that we saw in Soweto sort of acts of criminality. Now, I'm sorry, that's absolutely unfounded. And I would expect the Human Rights Commission and various others to come out and say what this is. These are hate crimes. These are attacks which take a deep-seated and very specific form of racism, whether you call it Afrophobia or xenophobia is fine. And we've seen attacks on people's lives. We've seen attacks also on their livelihoods. We've seen looting of shops. So let's call it what it is. Yes, the acts are criminal, but they're a specific kind of criminality, and that's massively concerning. And when President Zuma sent in various ministers from police, state security, etc., into KZN on Sunday, I think he showed that it was time that we approached this seriously. So earlier this year, we had a task team set up with Small Business Minister Lindiwe Zulu, and they tried to look at it more as an economic issue. And while those economic factors are here, and we have massive unemployment in the country, and we have huge socio-economic issues, there is a definite security issue here that has to be tackled. So well done to President Zuma for facing that. However, we do need to say, and Good Governance Africa is strong in this, that this was a case of too little too late. We've seen a number of commissions, we've seen a number of so-called interventions, and unfortunately we now see what we have in KZN, where 5 people have been murdered. And we just hope that this intervention, and if the police get bolstered, which they absolutely need to, that this will stop the spread so we won't see something similar to what we saw in 2008.
Now, what else needs to be done apart from sending out police or state units to assist? What else needs to be done, and what needs to be done to ensure that South Africans understand why there are foreigners or refugees or immigrants in South Africa, to ensure that this sort of violence doesn't occur again, like 2008?
Well, Lulu, I'd say the first thing that needs to be done right now, the emergency response, is that they need to quell what's happening in KZN. So more police need to be sent there. I think a lot of politicians have come forward today and realized that we are in a crisis, and they've admitted that. So we need more police forces. I don't think we necessarily need the army. They aren't trained for this kind of work, but more police is essential. We also need more humanitarian services in the camps. We need to see that the people who are there feel safe, that their basic needs are accounted for, and that they don't necessarily feel the need to be repatriated back to their countries, as you mentioned earlier. We don't necessarily want Somalis and Malawians to feel they have to go home, particularly in Somalia, which is a country plagued by attacks by Al-Shabaab, etc. These people have a right to be here. In terms of changing the greater sort of issue of, or the insidious issue, should I say, of xenophobic discourse that permeates our society, we need Jacob Zuma and a number of ministers to come out and say that statements by various political figures King Zwelithini, Goodwill Zwelithini in particular, are unacceptable. Those aren't the statements that are in fitting with our constitution. And then we need to have not necessarily a commission of inquiry, but we need to have all our politicians sit down together and say, how can we solve this problem? How can we get together and have an adequate political response? And in particular, how can we have a rule of law response? Because in the aftermath of 2008, unfortunately not enough perpetrators of those attacks were brought to book. They weren't sent to court and they weren't prosecuted, and that's massively problematic. So you need to change the discourse, yes, but you need to have rule of law that comes along and says, whether we set up special courts in KZN or do whatever we have to do, that these perpetrators are brought to book, because this behaviour is unacceptable.
Now, Kate, let's speak to the issue of South Africa alienating itself even further from the African continent, because seemingly there's a discourse between South Africa and referring to the rest of the continent as the rest of Africa. What does this sort of situation, or xenophobic violence or Afrophobia violence do to South Africa as a country, looking at it from other Africans on the continent?
Well, I would imagine that they would be incredibly annoyed with various views that are coming across from South Africa, and not just from the perpetrators of the attacks. Let's be honest, there are a lot of people here who have xenophobic sentiment, a lot of South Africans. And I think that how that's going to tarnish our image internationally is that we have to be concerned about how this is going to look in terms of regional bodies. So when we want to stand up in SADC and say that we think certain behavior in our neighboring countries is not acceptable, if we want to stand up in the African Union and have a strong stance on various economic issues or security issues, we lose credibility. And we need to go back and remember that this isn't just about how the rest of the continent views us. This is also about international standards of law. And we've signed acts to say that we will welcome refugees into our countries. We have a moral duty and a legal imperative to protect them. We should also be welcoming economic migrants who are in some cases more highly skilled than we are in South Africa. The data here, if you have a look, for example, at Good Governance Africa's survey that we do, education levels in places like Rwanda and Zimbabwe are high. We could benefit from having those skills. Yes, we have approximately 25% unemployment in this country, but we need to find a way to balance those. So South Africa needs to work incredibly hard at quelling these attacks, but also, exactly as you say, improving our image on the continent and abroad.
Okay, thank you so much for joining us.